Hello. In this lesson, we will be looking at the writer D.H. Lawrence and his short story, The Rocking Horse Winner. So let's begin with a little bit of biography about D.H. Lawrence. That's David Herbert, if you happen to be curious about what the D.H. stands for, but he's always referred to in literary circles as D.H. Lawrence. He was born in Eastwood, Nottinghamshire, so I'll say a little bit more about this in a bit, but a very small town, very poor coal mining area of the country. And he died relatively young. He was 44 when he died in 1930 of tuberculosis. He suffered from that throughout kind of the latter part of his life. Let's talk a little bit about where he particularly came from then. Eastwood, like I said, is a coal mining town, not a wealthy part of the country, and he did not grow up as a wealthy family. And usually this would not have allowed very much education for him. Most children in that area just did the bare minimum amount of school. He was lucky he did very well in school, and he won a scholarship essentially to go to the county Nottingham's high school, and then he was eventually able to go on to college and take a degree. And with that degree, he actually came back briefly to Eastwood, to the local kind of elementary school, and he worked there as a teacher. He also afterwards went on to London and worked as a teacher there, which was around the time that he was beginning to write. And then once he started getting things published, he left teaching behind and worked full-time as a writer. So, a couple of things that you should know about him, more biography on him. So I mentioned that he moved to London. This is around the time he begins to write. In fact, for a little while, when he was in school, he was sick, and he went to a hospital where he met a lady who encouraged him to write, and she actually got his some of his short stories sent off to a journal called The Egoist, that was edited by another writer, not quite as famous. His name is Ford Madox Ford, that began publishing him. So, as he was beginning his literary career, he had a rather scandalous affair. It was actually the wife of a professor he had in university. Her name was Frida Weekly. She was older than he was, which was kind of scandalous at the time. And she was obviously married at the time. So they actually ended up eloping. They went off, to, Germany or Austria, I forget which exactly, in order to, get married. Led to some trouble a little bit further down the line as World War I, began. The British military officials actually thought that he and his wife, Frida, were basically working as spies and sending signals to German submarines off the coast. It's one of the reasons that later in life he decided to entirely abandon England. He only came back there a couple of times in the later period of his life. Another reason was because of his novels. So D.H. Lawrence is most known for novels that often look at women and sexuality. Here we've got a picture of Lady Chatterley's Lover, probably his most famous one. But some of his other novels, like The Rainbow and Women in Love, deal, quite frankly, with subjects, married women that have affairs because they're in a loveless and a sexless marriage, those sorts of things. And they were met with a lot of censorship at the time, and something that he took to heart. It really bothered him that people were so had such a strong reaction to his books. So that was one of the other reasons then that he left England. On the continent, they didn't have as strong of an opinion about that sort of thing, so he wasn't scandalized as much. So he moved around quite a bit, Germany, Austria, Italy, places like Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and he actually came over to North America as well. I mentioned he suffered from tuberculosis. He was looking for dry climates that were easier on his health, and he actually bought a ranch in New Mexico. Became very interested in painting in the later periods of his short life. Okay, let's talk about the particular story, The Rocking Horse Winner, here somewhat quickly. It was first published in 1926 in Harper's Bazaar magazine. It's an example of modernist literature. That's the time period we're now in the early 20th century. And some features of modernist literature is a limited narration. You don't have, an omniscient narrator that is completely trustworthy. They usually kind of narrow it to a certain view of certain characters and what's going on in certain characters' heads, or not inside the characters' heads at all, and only an external view. So there's a lot in this story that we're not going to be able to know for sure. So modernist is very much about kind of limiting the amount of information we get. Modernism also reacts to the changing world, kind of in the early 20th century, the loss of social structures, the church is becoming less important than it used to be. The changing economic times, we're moving past the Industrial Revolution into a more of a free market, so it doesn't have the same kind of old aristocratic social structures where families from money were always from money. And that's one of the cases in this particular story. There's a lot of attention to money, and the family has fallen on hard times. So in that sense, this story is quite modernist. That idea of trying to live in the past in a new world that is much more chaotic. So that's something to look for. Modernism also puts a lot of emphasis on the particular individual. It sees individuals as alienated from other people, which kind of ties into the idea of a breakdown of social structures. Modernism often is rather bleak and depressing, and part of it is because it sees the individual as isolated from others. Okay, so a couple of things to think about as we read this particular thing. Think about the roles of the adults in the story. We've got the mother, who the boy obviously has a close tie to. A lot of us are going to probably say she's a really bad mother. Maybe a question to ask is she a mother who loves her son? Might be going about it in the wrong way, but ultimately loves him. But we also get, the Uncle Paul and Bassett, the groundskeeper, and we might have different attitudes towards their role in the whole affair. So how do we end up judging them? What do you think Lawrence wants to say about adults and family structures in general in this story? Some other things to look at. There are some supernatural elements in this story, which is not a very typical modernist thing. The house kind of whispers at some points, and the boy has this kind of clairvoyant knowledge about who wins these horse races. That's probably an element of, there's some symbolism to that. So start thinking about perhaps what is the message that Lawrence wants to get at behind this kind of otherworldly knowledge. And finally, we see luck. And if we look back to last week when we talked about theme, remember theme is more than just like the topic. So luck would be like a topic of the story, but a theme is kind of a summation, generalization about the story's meaning. What do you think this story wants to say about luck? What is the meaning of luck in this story? Okay, so that's something to think about. I hope you enjoy the story.